Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be checking out the KingJade Torch Dragon. Now, KingJade probably isn't a brand name you'll recognize as they are a newer name in the mousepad world, but despite them being a newer brand, they actually make some very high quality mousepads that have some great performance. Now in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the Torch Dragon, but KingJade was also kind enough to send over the Fuxi as well, so I'll have a review on that pad coming out in a couple weeks, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that review. And as always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps available down in the video description. Alright, well let's go ahead and get started. First we're going to talk about the pad's performance, and then we'll talk more in depth about the other unique aspects of the KingJade Torch Dragon. Alright, and in terms of testing time and parameters, I tested the Torch Dragon with the X-Ray Obsidian Air Donut Skates at 40 cm per 360, and I tested the Torch Dragon for about 3 weeks, daily driving the pad for both work and gaming. Now just to quickly clarify, I did test a bunch of other skates here on the Torch Dragon, but there were some compatibility issues with different skates on this pad, but I'll talk more about that later on in this video. Alright, now in terms of in-game performance, the Torch Dragon is a very unique pad. The pad surface to the hand feels similar to that of the X-Ray Pad Heavy B, where it feels like you're touching a raincoat, but of course the Torch Dragon has significantly less textural feedback than the Heavy B did, and the performance profiles are completely different. Now it's a little difficult to classify the Torch Dragon in terms of its performance profile. I would best classify this pad as a hybrid control pad, as the pad has a hybrid-like speed to it, but the surface stitching is very linear and very X-axis optimized, like you'd see on the average control pad. Now the difference between the X and Y axis is slighter than you'd expect on a control pad, so this pad feels much more balanced, if that makes sense. There is of course still a difference in the axes on the pad, but it's much slighter than you'd expect. The pad is also quite soft, so there is a decent range of control variability here, which makes the pad feel even more controlled during use. This means that the Torch Dragon feels best for games that rely heavily on X-axis static and flicking performance, but also a little bit on Y-axis dynamic aiming. Valorant is the perfect example of the ideal use case for this pad, as the aiming required for that game is very X-axis dependent, but there is also some Y-axis aiming required. Now, as someone who plays a lot of dynamic aiming shooters like Splitgate, Overwatch 2, and Quake, I definitely felt the difference in the X and Y axis, but the differencing never hampered or felt negative in terms of my performance. I was still able to perform consistently in more dynamic aim dependent games, but where the Torch Dragon felt the best was in games like Valorant. But across the board, the Torch Dragon really impressed me. It's definitely a unique pad in terms of its axis balancing and usage, but it's a pad I surprisingly enjoyed using despite the differencing in the X and Y axis, something I normally dislike on a lot of mouse pads. Alright, let's talk about the unboxing next. The Torch Dragon comes flat packed in this gorgeous packaging. This is without a doubt one of the best looking packaging I've ever seen for a mouse pad. The packaging is of course reusable too, which is great to see. Inside we have the pad itself, which is wrapped in a plastic sleeve, which is a great attention to detail. The Torch Dragon itself is this eye-catching matte pink color, which looks amazing in person. The camera does not do justice to the coloring on this pad. It looks really great in person. Now the Torch Dragon is available in 3 different sizes. There is the small, which is 420 by 300 millimeters. There is a medium, which is 490 by 420 millimeters, and a large, which is 500 by 490. All sizes are 4 millimeters thick. Now, since the Torch Dragon is flat packed, it does sit perfectly flat out of the box, but since it is flat packed, I'd avoid reverse rolling or bending the pad, as you could damage the surfacing. There was no notes inside the packaging saying you could damage the surfacing, but with any flat pack pad, I'd just be careful with that. Overall though, the unboxing here for the Torch Dragon is quite solid. I would have liked to see a plastic base cover like we saw for the Samurai, as that make it much easier to repackage the pad, but this is a pretty minimal complaint. Overall, the experience is great, and the packaging art is, for me, the biggest highlight. I kind of wish the pad itself has the same art as the box, but the matte pink coloring here on the Torch Dragon is still fantastic and very eye-catching. Alright, let's talk build quality and QC next. Overall, the Torch Dragon is surprisingly well QC'd. The surfacing is consistent, it doesn't have any dead zones. The base implementation is fantastic and it performs decently well. The edge stitching is also pretty well implemented. The only issue I have with it is that where the edge stitching ends, there is a dual layered wrapping, which I'm happy to see, but it's a little more pronounced and a little warped, and it just stands out a little more than it does on other pads. This of course isn't an issue from a performance point of view, but from a cosmetic point of view, it would be nice to see this edge wrapping tightened up a little bit so it didn't stand out so much, but again, this is a very minimal issue. But overall, the QC and build quality here on the Torch Dragon is fantastic. Despite KingJade being a relatively unknown brand and a newer brand, their pad quality and QC is fantastic. Alright, let's talk about the surfacing next. The surfacing here on the Torch Dragon is a non-treated surface, so there isn't going to be any kind of work-in period like we'd see on a heat-treated surface, but the stitching itself is very tightly woven, probably the tightest I've ever seen on a pad. Under the microscope, you can see this pad stitching is this incredibly tightly woven wide-like surface stitch that runs bi-directionally evenly on the pad's x-axis. Zooming out a little more, we can see the surface texture due to this bidirectional stitching ends up having this linear line-like texturing that runs parallel across the x-axis of the pad. This linear x-axis focused stitching is why, as I talked about earlier, the Torch Dragon feels best for x-axis aiming, as there is the least resistance from the pad stitching on that axis. For y-axis movements, there's going to be more resistance as you're going against that linear stitching, hence the differencing in the x and y-axis resistance and texturing you'll feel here on the Torch Dragon. Now, in terms of how the Torch Dragon feels in terms of friction, measured using the XtraPad Obsidian Air Donuts, the pad's initial friction felt like a 4 out of 10, the pad's dynamic friction felt a little more controlled, coming in more around a 6 out of 10, and the braking friction feels similar to the initial friction, being around a 4 out of 10. Now, keep in mind that the skate material or larger or smaller surface areas will affect these values slightly, so just keep in mind your experience here on the pad may be slightly different depending on your skates. Now, you might have noticed that the surface characteristics here aren't exactly very controlled, and that's because the control you feel here on the Torch Dragon is largely caused by the pad's softness, not by the surfacing. I'll talk more about the control variability and the softness here on the Torch Dragon in a moment. Now, before we move on, I did want to make a quick note here about tilting the pad. Since the surfacing is linear on the x-axis, you can shift the orientation of the pad by 90 degrees to shift the linear stitching to run along the y-axis of the pad, increasing the control you feel on the x-axis. But since all the sizes here for the Torch Dragon are rectangular, specifically like the medium size I have here, this trick can only be used on the large size as it's the closest to a square pad. It's still slightly rectangular, but it's most usable on that larger pad size. So if you want a little bit more control on the x-axis, you can get it by tilting the pad, but you can only do it on the largest version of the Torch Dragon. Alrighty, let's talk about the Torch Dragon's softness and degree of control variability next. As I mentioned earlier, all the Torch Dragon pads are 4mm thick, and as we normally see on thicker pads, the Torch Dragon is quite soft. The degree of softness I'd say is similar to what we found on the Infinity Mice Ruin or the XtraPad Origins Pro Cerberus Extra Soft, where it feels like you can push through the pad and your force is stopped by what's underneath the pad, not the pad itself. The pad does have a very quick rebound to it though, so if you press deeply into the pad bounces back quite quickly, which is great to see. Now, this high degree of softness would make you think that the pad will have a very high degree of control variability, but just like we saw in the Ruin and the Cerberus, this pad is so soft where it's very easy to press too hard into the pad, causing your mouse to bottom out. So the range of control variability here on the Torch Dragon is much smaller than you'd expect for a pad this soft, but there is still enough control variability here where you can force the pad to feel significantly slower, making the surface feel much more controlled and drastically increasing the initial and braking friction here on the pad. Over my testing with the XtraPad Obsidian Donuts, I was able to easily push into the pad without bottoming my mouse out, which gave the Torch Dragon significantly more control and made the pad just overall feel much more on the control side of the spectrum rather than the hybrid side as I described earlier. Now, keep in mind that the skates you're going to be using on this pad and your grip style and grip weight will affect how much control you're going to feel here on the Torch Dragon by a pretty significant margin, so keep that in mind. Your experience may vary depending on your setup. Alrighty, let's talk about skate compatibility next. Now, since the Torch Dragon is so soft, the skate compatibility here is going to be heavily hampered compared to what we see on a firmer pad. From my testing, I found that full-size stock skates and donut skates were perfectly usable here on the Torch Dragon, but dots, speed stock skates, and smaller surface area stock skates like the stocks on the Ponage Stormbreaker instantly bottomed out when any weight was added to them, which made them unusable here on the Torch Dragon. Now, in terms of what skate type felt best here on the Torch Dragon, control skates like the TGX Exact skates or the XtraPad Obsidian Air Donut skates felt good and helped to balance out the faster x-axis of the pad, but y-axis movements were a little slow, which did kind of hamper the usage for more dynamic aiming games, but still made the pad very good for more static oriented games. Hybrid and speed skates felt very good as well, as they did kind of help to balance out the x and y axising. Of course, the y-axis still had a little more resistance due to the surface stitching, but they felt a little more balanced overall, which did make the pad feel significantly faster, which made the pad better for more dynamic aiming games, but worse for more static optimized games. Now, keep in mind that skate usage here on the Torch Dragon is entirely personal preference. As always, I recommend experimenting with different skates to find what fits your aim style the best, as what works for me may not work for you in terms of your personal aim style. Alrighty, let's talk about the Torch Dragon's base next. KingJade is advertising that this pad is using a Nui Poron base. I hope I'm saying that right. Now, I've never heard of this naming convention for Poron before, but apparently this is Rogers Poron, at least according to KingJade's advertisements for the Torch Dragon. Now, when it comes to Poron on pads, I'm always a little skeptical because we've seen a lot of fake Poron out there or Rogers Poron before. But regardless if this is real Poron or a rubber-like material that's very Poron-like here on the Torch Dragon, the base does perform very well. While the base isn't exactly sticky to the hand, the base does anchor itself quite well with a little bit of surface pressure. It does take a little while for the base to fully anchor, of course, but once the base is anchored, it actually stays in place quite well. You can cause the pad to kind of shift a little bit if you put an insane amount of pressure onto the surface, but this is more pressure than you'd ever put on it during normal use, so this isn't really an issue in my opinion. Now, due to the pour-on base material here on the Torch Dragon, I did do some testing with some moisture, and adding a little bit of moisture to the tabletop surface and then putting the pad on top of it, the moisture didn't really make the pad get stickier, which again kind of leads me to question the legitimacy of the pour-on here, because generally speaking, pour-on bases get very sticky when moisture is added to them, but this one doesn't. Now, interestingly enough, I have covered a pad before that had a pour-on base like this that had similar performance, and that pad was the Fnatic-2. Funnily enough, the bases almost look identical between the two pads. One just has the Fnatic branding onto the bottom where the KingJade pad doesn't. So maybe KingJade is manufacturing their pads in the same factory that Fnatic used for their pads. I did reach out to KingJade and ask them about the similarity with the bases and ask them if they're using the same factory, and they declined to answer, so I guess that kind of answers our question here. But regardless of these similarities here between the bases on the Dash 2 and the Torch Dragon here, the base here in the Torch Dragon does perform very well. Again, I'm not going to say it's real pour-on just because it doesn't act like pour-on. It could be a rubber pour-on like material, but regardless of whatever it's made of, it does perform quite well, which is great to see. Alright, let's talk about edge stitching next. The Torch Dragon's edge stitching is the usual rounded edge stitch that's about equal to the height of the surface of the pad. The edge stitching's roundness makes it very easy to run your arm across or along the edge stitch, and it doesn't cause any unnecessary friction during use, which is awesome to see. As I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the pad's QC, the edge stitching here in the Torch Dragon is pretty much perfect. There's no loose stitches or anything like that, but the dual layered edge stitch at the termination point of the edge stitching is a little thicker than I've seen on other pads. It does stand out in kind of a negative way from a cosmetic point of view. It would be nice to see KingJade kind of thin this out and make it closer to the edge stitching we've seen on the X-ray pads, but of course this is a very minimal complaint, and again, it doesn't impact the performance of the pad. It's purely a cosmetic issue. But overall, aside from the edge stitching here on the Torch Dragon being a little thick towards the end, the overall QC of the edge stitching is fantastic and it's been implemented very well. Alrighty, let's talk about the effects of moisture next. One very odd feature that KingJade is advertising here on the Torch Dragon is that the pad surface is fully waterproof. But unlike we've seen in other waterproof pads where the water just gets sucked into the pad itself, kind of like what we saw in the Zowie GSR2, the Torch Dragon doesn't absorb water at all. Any water added to the surface of the pad beads on the top and stays there, as it can't drain through this very tightly woven surface stitching. Now, you can cause water to drain into the pad by pressing into the pad and widening the surface stitching, but even then the water absorbs very, very slowly into the pad itself, which makes the Torch Dragon, as advertised by KingJade, largely waterproof, which is a very interesting thing we haven't seen on too many mouse pads. Now, if water does manage to get into the pad surfacing, it does affect the pad surface and makes it significantly slower. I can see now why KingJade made this pad waterproof, as the pad turns into an absolute mud pad whenever some moisture actually gets into the pad stitching. So because of this, I can't really recommend the Torch Dragon from use in like a high humidity environment, as high humidity will significantly slow down the pad, but at least this water resistance does make the pad immune to sweat, which is nice to see. But keep in mind, as always, that the pad's resistance to moisture and its overall performance in higher or lower moisture environments will differ from environment to environment, so your use case may vary. Now, another interesting thing that KingJade is advertising here for the Torch Dragon is that it is a skin-friendly surface, similar to what X-ray pad was advertising with the heavy beat pads. Now, from my use, I will say that the Torch Dragon is without a doubt the most skin-friendly pad I've ever used. Moving your bare arm across the X and Y axis of the pad, there is barely any resistance. I will say on the y-axis, because there is a different texturing from the x-axis, there is slightly more friction, but it's a very low amount of friction, nothing that's going to negatively impact your usage. Arm sleeve usage is also extremely good here. There is slightly more friction on an arm sleeve compared to bare arm, but it's a very minimal difference, and overall the pad is extremely compatible with both bare arm and arm sleeve usage. It is without a doubt the most skin-friendly pad I've used. I'm not really sure why. Maybe it's the way the surface stitching is done, or maybe it's the surface material, but it is without a doubt the most skin-friendly pad I've ever used. It feels fantastic to use with a bare arm. Alrighty, and lastly, I wanted to quickly talk about the effects of pet hair and dust. Now, since the Torch Dragon surface is so tightly woven, and the only time the surface stitching kind of opens up is when you actually put pressure onto the surface stitching, just like what we saw with moisture resistance, this pad is pretty much completely immune to dust and pet hair. Anything that lands on the pad can be easily dusted off with either your hand or a microfiber cloth, and over my testing, I didn't have any issues with pet hair or affecting the surface surface or dust. I also didn't have any issues with like dead skin causing any kind of dead zones on the pad as well. Because the pad is so skin friendly, there's not really a lot of wear on your arm, so you don't really have to be concerned about that at all. But overall, the Torch Dragon is pretty much completely immune to both pet hair and dust, which is a fantastic feature to see here on this pad. Alrighty, well, in closing, overall, I'm actually very impressed with the KingJade Torch Dragon here. This is definitely one of the more unique pads I've covered here on the channel, and I think the best way I can kind of describe this pad is that it's the best Valorant optimized pad I've covered here on the channel. And what I mean by that is that the pad is very X-axis dependent, where it's very good for X-axis static and flicking performance, but because the X and Y axis is so close to being the same, again, it's not fully balanced like you'd see on a hybrid pad, but it's closer to being fully balanced than you've seen on other control pads on the market. Like for example, the Raven Mori V2 or the X-Ray Pad Heavy B pads, it's closer than them, so it feels more balanced. So Y-axis or more dynamic aiming is more usable here in this pad than it would be on a regular control pad. So you kind of have the best of both worlds, which kind of makes the Torch Dragon a hybrid pad in terms of its performance, but it's also not a hybrid pad at the same time. It's very hard to describe what this pad is. I think just again, as I mentioned before, the best way to summarize it is that it's the best Valorant optimized pad I've covered here on the channel. Unfortunately for me, because I prefer fully balanced pads that have no differencing in the X and Y axis, this isn't a pad I'm going to use, but this is definitely one of the more unique pads I've tried. And again, despite this not being a fully balanced pad, I actually really do like this pad. I do wish it was fully balanced. I think I would like it a lot more if it was, but in its current state, it is still a very unique pad and probably the most Valorant optimized pad I've ever covered here on the channel. If you'd like to learn more about the KingJade Torch Dragon or any of their other pads, I will have their product links down in the video description so you can learn more or pick one up for yourself. But that's going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much to KingJade for sending over the Torch Dragon. I greatly appreciate it. As I mentioned earlier, they were also kind of sent over the Fuxi pad, and I will be covering that one in a couple weeks, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. Big thank you to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunars, whose support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing here with the in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, you can become a member here for only $2 Canadian a month. That is the best way to directly support the channel, and thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Letho Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, Met Keys, and TJ Exclusives, as well as a couple other retailers to save yourself some money on your orders and help directly support the channel. But that's everything for today. Thank you very much again for watching my review of the KingJade Torch Dragon, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.